The champagne was cold and the chandeliers were bright, and everybody in that ballroom believed the worst was behind us. It was the autumn of 1949. The war had been over for 4 years, and Los Angeles was still drunk on victory. You could feel it in the way people dressed, in the way they laughed, in the way they held their glasses a little too high and smiled a little too wide. We had won something, and we wanted the world to see us enjoying it. The benefit that evening was for a children's hospital. 300 guests in their finest clothes gathered in the grand ballroom of a hotel on Wilshire Boulevard. Crystal and silver and white tablecloths. An orchestra playing something by Cole Porter, and the women in their evening gowns swaying slightly as they spoke, as if the music moved through them without their permission. The men wore black tie. The women wore pearls and perfume that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. There was an optimism in that room that seems almost impossible to remember now. We believed we had earned happiness. We believed we had paid for it in blood and sacrifice. And now the bill was settled, and the future belonged to us. I was there because someone had asked me to be there. That was how it worked in those days. You showed up. You shook hands. You let people take photographs. It was part of the arrangement, part of what you owed for the life you had been given. I remember standing near one of the tall windows, watching the room. There is something about crowds that has always made me watchful. You learn things by standing still while others move. You see what people do when they think no one important is looking. That was when I first noticed her. She was one of the servers, a young black woman, perhaps 22 or 23 years old. She moved through the crowd with a silver tray balanced on her left hand, offering champagne to the guests. Her uniform was pressed and spotless. Her posture was perfect. She did not smile too much or too little. She did exactly what the evening required of her, and she did it with a kind of quiet precision that told me she had learned, the hard way, how to be invisible when invisibility was what kept you safe. I watched her work her way across the room. Most of the guests took glasses from her tray without looking at her face. Some did not even pause their conversations. She was a pair of hands delivering champagne, nothing more. But then she reached the table near the orchestra, where a small group of women had gathered. They were wives of studio executives, women who lunched together and sat on charity boards together, and believed their opinions carried weight, simply because their husbands wrote large checks. One of them was a woman I will call Mrs. Carlisle. I had met her before at events like this one. She was perhaps 45, attractive in the way that expensive maintenance can make a woman attractive, and she had a reputation for speaking her mind in ways that others found charming or cutting, depending on which end of her tongue you happened to be standing near. The young server approached the table and offered her tray. Mrs. Carlisle looked up. She looked at the tray. Then she looked at the young woman holding it, and something in her expression changed. It was small. You might have missed it if you were not watching closely. A tightening around the mouth, a slight narrowing of the eyes. The kind of adjustment a person makes when they have encountered something they find distasteful but cannot acknowledge openly. She did not take a glass. Instead, she turned to the woman beside her and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "I believe I will wait for another server. One never knows where those hands have been." The words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. The young server did not move. Her hand remained steady. Her face remained composed. But I saw something flicker behind her eyes, something that was not surprise, because this was not surprising to her. It was recognition. She had heard words like this before. She had learned to expect them. The other women at the table shifted uncomfortably. One of them laughed, a small, nervous sound. Another looked away. None of them said anything. The young woman lowered her tray and stepped back. She was going to leave. She was going to absorb this wound and carry it with her through the rest of the evening, and say nothing, because saying nothing was what she had been taught to do. Saying nothing was how you kept your job. Saying nothing was how you survived. I set down my glass and crossed the room. I did not plan what I was going to say. I did not rehearse it. I only knew that I could not stand at that window and watch this happen and do nothing. There are moments when silence becomes a choice, and the choice becomes a verdict on your own character. When I reached the table, the women looked up at me with expressions of pleased surprise. Mrs. Carlisle's face brightened immediately. "Why, Mr. Peck?" she said, and her voice was suddenly warm, almost coquettish. "What a wonderful surprise. I was just saying to Margaret how much I admired your last picture." I did not smile. I looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence do its work. Then I turned to the young server. "Miss," I said, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of that champagne." She hesitated. Her eyes moved between me and the women at the table, trying to read the situation, trying to understand what was happening. "Please," I said, "if you would." She lifted her tray and I took a glass. I held it in my hand and looked at it for a moment. Then I turned back to Mrs. Carlisle. "This young woman," I said, "has been on her feet for hours tonight, serving guests who have barely acknowledged her existence. She has done her job with more grace and dignity than most of the people in this room will ever manage. And you have just humiliated her in public for the crime of offering you a drink." The warmth drained from Mrs. Carlisle's face. She stared at me as if I had slapped her. "I beg your pardon," she said. You simply made certain that everyone within earshot understood your contempt for this young woman," I said. "You did it casually, the way one might swat a fly, and you expected no consequences, because you believed she had no power to demand any." The other women at the table had gone very still. The orchestra played on, oblivious, but at the surrounding tables, conversations were dying. People were beginning to turn and watch. "Mr. Peck," Mrs. Carlisle said, and now there was an edge in her voice. "I do not think you understand. There are certain standards, certain expectations. You were merely being cruel," I said, "and you were counting on everyone else to pretend they had not noticed." I turned to the young server. She was standing very straight, her face carefully neutral, but I could see the rapid pulse in her throat. "What is your name?" I asked her. She blinked. It was not a question she had expected. "Dorothy," she said. "Dorothy Williams." "Miss Williams," I said, "I apologize, not for myself, but for the fact that you have been made to feel unwelcome in a room where you have done nothing but work with skill and professionalism. That is not how guests should treat those who serve them. It is not how Americans should treat one another." She looked at me for a long moment. I do not know what she was thinking. Perhaps she was wondering if this was some kind of trick. Perhaps she was calculating the cost of accepting kindness from a white man in a room full of white faces. Perhaps she was simply exhausted. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. And then, with the same careful grace she had shown all evening, she nodded and moved on to continue her work. I turned back to Mrs. Carlisle. Her face was flushed now, her jaw tight. "You are making a scene," she said. "Over nothing." "Over nothing," I repeated. "A woman was humiliated in front of 100 people, and you call it nothing." "She is a servant," Mrs. Carlisle said, and her voice was rising now, losing its careful polish. "She is here to do a job. She is not here to be coddled and complimented." "She is here to do a job," I agreed. "But she is not here to be degraded. There is a difference, Mrs. Carlisle. The fact that you cannot see it tells me everything I need to know." I took a sip of the champagne. It was very good champagne. It tasted like money and self-congratulation. "You admire my pictures," I said. "You told me so. But do you understand what they are about? Do you understand what it means to play a man who stands up for what is right, even when it costs him? Or do you just enjoy the spectacle without hearing the message?" She did not answer. The women around her were looking anywhere but at me. The nearest tables had fallen silent. I could feel the weight of attention pressing against my back. "We just won a war," I said. "We sent our sons and brothers overseas to fight against a regime that believed some people were less than human because of how they were born. We celebrated when that regime fell. We told ourselves we were different. We told ourselves we stood for something better." I set the glass down on the table. "But we are not different," I said. "Not yet. Not as long as we treat people the way you treated Miss Williams tonight. Not as long as we believe that our wealth or our skin or our place in society gives us permission to wound those who cannot wound us back." Mrs. Carlisle's mouth opened, then closed. She had no answer. Perhaps she had never been spoken to this way. Perhaps she had surrounded herself with people who agreed with her, or who were too afraid to disagree. "I am not going to lecture you," I said. "That is not my place. But I want you to think about something. That young woman you dismissed tonight, she will go home after this event is over. She will take off her uniform and sit down in whatever small room she rents, and she will remember what you said to her. She will carry it with her tomorrow, and the day after that. It will become part of the weight she bears simply for existing in a world that refuses to see her as fully human. I straightened my jacket. And you will go home to your house in Bel Air, and you will drink another glass of champagne, and by morning you will have forgotten this conversation entirely. That is the difference between you. That is the measure of what you have done. I nodded to the other women, who could not meet my eyes. Ladies, I said, good evening. I walked away from that table and I did not look back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. People spoke to me the way they always spoke to me, but I could feel the difference in the room. Word had traveled. Something had shifted. A few men nodded at me with something that might have been respect. A few women looked away when I passed, as if I had committed some breach of manners they could not name but recognized instinctively. Mrs. Carlisle and her friends left early. I saw them gathering their wraps and moving toward the exit, with tight faces and quick steps. I do not know what she told people afterward. I do not know if she changed or if she simply learned to be more careful about who was listening. Some people meet a challenge and grow from it. Others simply become more skilled at hiding what they were always willing to believe. I never saw Dorothy Williams again. I looked for her at other events over the years, but she was never there. Perhaps she found other work. Perhaps she moved away. Perhaps she simply became one of the millions of people who pass through our lives and disappear, leaving only the faint impression of a moment shared. But I have never forgotten her face in that ballroom. The careful composure, the practiced invisibility, the way she absorbed cruelty as if it were weather, something to be endured rather than fought. I think about her sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels very old. I think about all the Dorothy Williamses I never noticed, all the small humiliations I witnessed and did not challenge, all the times I stood at windows and watched and said nothing. One moment of speaking does not erase the silence that came before. But I learned something that night in that ballroom. I learned that dignity is not something you grant to others. It is something they already possess. The only question is whether you are willing to see it. The chandeliers are dark now. The orchestra has long since stopped playing. The champagne has gone flat in glasses no one will ever drink. But somewhere, I hope, a woman named Dorothy Williams is still standing straight, still moving through rooms with grace, still carrying herself with the quiet dignity that no insult could ever take from her. That is what I choose to remember. That is what I hope was worth the cost of speaking.